The wedding suite was supposed to be a place of champagne toasts, silk sheets, and whispered promises. Instead, by the time police officers forced their way in, it looked more like a crime scene from a nightmare. The air was heavy with the smell of perfume and wilted roses, but beneath it was something sharper, sour, the kind of stench that clings to the back of your throat. A young bride, still in her gown with mascara streaked down her cheeks, was screaming into her phone when the first responders rushed through the door. Her husband, the man she had vowed to love and cherish just hours earlier, was lying on the bed, motionless. And what they saw when they pulled the covers back left even the most seasoned officers stunned. The groom's skin, pale and damp with sweat, was marred by strange wounds. One officer gagged, muttering, "This doesn't happen in hours. This is rot." The bride covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably, insisting she had no idea what had happened. The honeymoon suite, booked at one of the most expensive hotels in the city, had transformed into a chamber of horror. Detectives began their work with precision, their voices low but urgent. They took photographs, marked the bedding with evidence tags, and quietly speculated about poisons, chemical burns, or some new kind of designer drug. The rapid decay of the man's wounds didn't fit into anything ordinary. What made it worse was the context. This wasn't some anonymous victim pulled from a back alley. This was a freshly married groom, a man whose wedding was still trending on social media that very evening. Guests had posted smiling photos just hours earlier. The couple dancing under twinkle lights, the bride tossing her bouquet, champagne glasses clinking. And now, barely past midnight, those same images were being drowned out by whispers of foul play. The bride's story only raised more questions. Between sobs, she told police she had woken up in the early hours and found her husband breathing strangely, his body twitching as if in pain. When she tried to shake him awake, he didn't respond. That's when she noticed the smell, pungent, rotten, impossible to ignore. She screamed, dialed 911, and tried pressing on his chest, but it was useless. By the time paramedics arrived, his body was already cold. She clutched her veil like a lifeline as officers asked the same questions over and over. Had he been sick? Did he take any drugs? Did he eat or drink anything unusual at the wedding? Each time she shook her head, her voice rising in panic. No, he was fine, he was healthy, he was just here with me. And then this. But the detectives weren't convinced. Something in her tone didn't match the terror on her face. One noticed how her hands trembled not only from shock, but as though she was holding back another truth. Another pointed out the way she avoided looking at her husband's body, as if the sight carried not only grief but also unbearable guilt. In the corner of the room, a champagne bottle sat half empty, 2 flutes on the nightstand. One glass bore smudges of lipstick, the other was untouched. Outside in the hallway, guests who had stayed overnight whispered among themselves. Some said they'd heard shouting in the suite earlier, muffled but heated. Others recalled the bride disappearing briefly during the reception, her absence explained away by bridesmaids who said she had gone to freshen up. A few guests swore they saw her leaving the ballroom with someone who wasn't her new husband. The rumors spiraled quickly, and before long, the detectives had more to consider than just a mysterious medical anomaly. Forensic specialists lifted the groom's body onto a stretcher, the sheet pulled carefully over his distorted features. The bride collapsed against the wall, wailing as cameras flashed. Reporters had already gathered outside, tipped off by police radio chatter about a death at the city's most glamorous hotel. Paparazzi-style photos of the crying bride in her gown were destined to hit the tabloids before dawn. By morning, the story would dominate news feeds. Groom dies in honeymoon suite. Bride found screaming beside body. Yet behind the headlines, the investigators knew something darker lingered. Flesh doesn't rot within hours unless there is poison, disease, or something intentionally inflicted. As they zipped the body bag, one detective muttered what everyone else was thinking, but no one dared say aloud. Somebody wanted this man to die. And so the fairy tale wedding unraveled into a scandal, a mystery steeped in betrayal, shame, and secrets that would soon come to light. The honeymoon had become a crime scene, and the bride, still wrapped in white lace and trembling under the hotel's harsh lights, was no longer just a grieving widow. She was the only witness, the first suspect, and the keeper of a secret that could explain why the man she married was found with wounds that looked like they had been rotting for days. The question was no longer whether this was a tragic accident. The question was who had brought death into the wedding bed, and how a night meant for love had ended in horror. The story of how a wedding turned into a tragedy doesn't begin with the groom's final moments. It begins long before that, with a secret the bride carried in her marriage like a time bomb waiting to explode. On the surface, she had it all: the stunning white dress, the flowers, the adoring husband who was successful, well-respected, and deeply in love with her. To their families, they were the perfect couple. To their friends, the wedding was the fairy tale ending everyone craved. But the truth was, even as she said her vows, the bride's heart wasn't completely in that ballroom. It was still chained to a man from her past, her ex, the one she could never quite let go. They had been inseparable in their younger years, a relationship that burned hot, reckless, and intoxicating. But it also collapsed under the weight of betrayal and hardship. He was the type of man her parents hated, charming but unstable, drifting from job to job, often finding trouble. She eventually left him behind, convinced she deserved stability, a real future. That's when she met the groom, a man who gave her everything her ex never could: safety, comfort, respect. But in choosing stability, she never fully buried the passion. It festered inside her, a dangerous longing that no wedding vow could erase. The wedding reception was supposed to be the closing chapter of her past. She smiled through the toasts, posed for endless photos, and kissed her husband under a shower of confetti. But guests noticed moments when her smile faltered, when her eyes seemed elsewhere. They chalked it up to exhaustion. Only she knew the truth. Her ex had been invited quietly by one of her bridesmaids. He slipped in unnoticed among the crowd, lingering in the shadows of the ballroom, watching her twirl in her gown. When their eyes locked, something reckless stirred inside her. Later that night, as the music died down and the newlyweds were ushered toward their honeymoon suite, the bride's phone buzzed with a message that made her heart race. It was from him. One last time. Tonight. Meet me. She should have deleted it. She should have clutched her husband's hand and walked proudly into the future. Instead, temptation won. After the champagne toasts and staged exits, when everyone thought she had retreated with her groom, she slipped away. Surveillance footage from the hotel later showed what she tried to hide: her leaving the bridal suite around midnight, wrapped in her shawl, moving quickly down the hall. She met her ex in another room on a different floor, a room he had booked under a false name. What happened there was as inevitable as it was destructive. Years of unresolved passion spilled over, and in her mind, she convinced herself it was just a goodbye, a final taste before she locked the door forever. But what she didn't know was that her ex carried more than old feelings. He carried a sickness, a dangerous infection he had been battling in secret. When he touched her, when they gave in to desire, he passed something along. To him, it was nothing new. He had lived with the consequences for months, even years, too ashamed or too reckless to deal with it properly. But for her, it was the spark that would set the entire wedding night ablaze. She left his room flushed, disheveled, and trembling, returning to the suite where her husband lay waiting. She convinced herself it meant nothing, that no one would ever know, that she could bury it before dawn. What she hadn't considered was how quickly her choices would bleed into reality. Hours later, her husband stirred, groaning with pain. At first, she thought it was exhaustion, maybe too much champagne. But when he pulled the covers back and exposed the raw, blistering lesions spreading across his skin, panic surged through her veins. He was sweating profusely, shivering, his body fighting against something invisible yet vicious. She froze, torn between calling for help and protecting her secret. If she called an ambulance, doctors would ask questions. Tests would reveal things she couldn't explain. The chain would lead straight back to her betrayal. So she lied, soothing him, insisting it was food poisoning, maybe nerves. She promised he'd feel better after some rest. But in truth, she was buying time for herself, not for him. She prayed the symptoms would pass. Instead, they worsened with horrifying speed. His flesh began to darken, the stench filling the room as infection ripped through his body like wildfire. Neighbors in the adjoining suites later told police they heard muffled arguments. The groom's voice, weak but furious, demanding answers. The bride's sharp whispers, desperate and trembling. He suspected something was wrong, something she wasn't telling him. He pressed her, but she deflected, clinging to lies until the very end. The betrayal wasn't just in what she had done hours earlier. It was in the silence she kept as her husband's life ebbed away in front of her. By the time she finally dialed 911, it was too late. The groom's body had begun to shut down, organs failing one by one, septic shock setting in. The paramedics who arrived at the suite knew immediately this wasn't natural. They saw the advanced state of decay on a body that was still warm, and they exchanged grim looks that said everything. Something here was deeply, dangerously wrong. For the bride, what was supposed to be a secret encounter, a fleeting moment of passion, had become the trigger for an irreversible disaster. In chasing the ghost of her past, she had poisoned her future and destroyed the man who had trusted her most. What she thought she could hide for a lifetime had exploded in less than a night. And now, with the evidence beginning to mount, detectives were preparing to unravel the lies she had carefully spun around her marriage, exposing the affair that turned a wedding into a crime scene. The sun crept through the curtains of the honeymoon suite, casting a pale golden glow across the room that should have symbolized a new beginning. Instead, it lit up a scene of dread. The groom stirred first, his body drenched in sweat, sheets tangled around his legs. His breaths were short, ragged, like each inhale dragged fire into his chest. At first, the bride thought it was the aftermath of too much champagne and exhaustion from the endless festivities. But when he pushed the blanket aside, her blood ran cold. His skin was flushed with angry red blotches spreading across his stomach and thighs. Some had already darkened into deep, sickly purples, and the faint, sour, sickly odor of decay seeped into the air, impossible to ignore. He tried to sit up, clutching his abdomen, but the pain doubled him over. "Something's wrong," he whispered, his voice raw with fear. She rushed to his side, hands trembling as she touched his forehead. He was burning, his pulse racing, his body trembling violently. She wanted to scream for help, to call the front desk, or dial 911, but a darker thought held her back. If doctors came, if they ran tests, if questions were asked, the truth about what she had done hours earlier would unravel instantly. The secret she had guarded through her vows, through the reception, through the night, it would all come crashing out. So she lied to herself. She told him it must have been food poisoning, maybe bad seafood from the buffet, or simply stress from the wedding. She insisted it would pass. She dabbed his forehead with a cold cloth, brought him water, and begged him to rest. Inside, though, panic gnawed at her. She knew what this looked like. She remembered the reckless hours she had spent in another hotel room, tangled with a man she should have left in the past. She remembered the heat of his skin, the faint scars along his body, the cough he tried to stifle. And now, staring at her husband's blistering flesh, she realized she had carried more than guilt back into the bridal suite. As the hours dragged on, his condition worsened. The groom's once proud frame twisted with pain. He vomited into the wastebasket, his lips turning gray. His eyes, once filled with joy and love, now stared at her with suspicion. "What did you do to me?" he rasped. The question hit her like a blade. She stammered excuses, insisting she didn't know, that it wasn't her fault. But the way he looked at her, half delirious, half enraged, made her feel stripped bare. He sensed the betrayal, even if he couldn't articulate it. He could see in her trembling hands, in her tear-streaked face, in the way she avoided his gaze. Neighbors would later tell investigators they heard the muffled shouting through the walls. His voice, hoarse and broken, demanding answers. Hers, desperate and low, begging him to just stop, to rest, to not push her. The arguments ebbed into silence only when his strength began to fail completely. But that silence wasn't peace. It was the suffocating quiet of a man who realized the woman lying beside him wasn't just withholding comfort. She was withholding the truth that might have saved him. By midday, the room reeked of something foul and unnatural. The bride tried to mask it by spraying perfume, opening the window, even lighting a candle from her travel bag. But nothing could cover the sour, rotting smell seeping from his wounds. When she finally dared to peel back his shirt, she recoiled in horror. The skin on his side had started to blister and crack, leaking fluid that stained the sheets. She pressed her hands to her mouth, choking back bile. He was deteriorating in front of her, faster than seemed humanly possible. Her phone buzzed at one point. A message from the ex, a simple line. "Are you okay?" Her stomach dropped. She wanted to hurl the phone across the room, to scream that none of this was okay, that everything was unraveling. But instead, she deleted the text and slipped the phone under a pillow, praying her husband hadn't noticed. He was too far gone in a fevered dreams to care, muttering incoherent fragments, cursing under his breath, groaning in agony. Each sound drove her further into a corner of shame. By the time the afternoon sun dipped lower, the bride was no longer thinking about the marriage, the future, or even her reputation. She was thinking about survival. Hers, not his. She paced the room, wringing her hands, whispering to herself. She could call for help, but it would mean explaining everything. Or she could wait, hope the nightmare somehow burned itself out, hope he would stabilize, and they could bury this horror along with her guilt. It was a gamble, a selfish, desperate gamble. But the human body doesn't wait for secrets to settle. His breathing became shallow, his skin clammy and mottled. When he clutched her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakness, his eyes bore into hers with one last surge of clarity. "You betrayed me," he croaked. The words shattered her. She pulled away, collapsing at the foot of the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. That was the last coherent thing he ever said. Moments later, his body convulsed once, twice, and then went frighteningly still. For several minutes, she sat frozen, staring at him, waiting for the rise and fall of his chest that never came. The perfume-drenched air mixed with the stench of decay, wrapping her in a suffocating reminder of everything she had done. Only when the silence grew unbearable did she finally reach for her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, her voice cracking as she cried, "My husband isn't breathing. Please, please come." But even as she screamed, a part of her knew she had already waited too long. When paramedics arrived, they found a man who looked as though he had been dead for days, not hours. His skin bore the grotesque evidence of an infection that had spread like wildfire, leaving behind the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh. The bride clung to them, wailing, insisting she had done everything she could. But inside, she was drowning in the knowledge of her silence. The doctors would find out. The police would ask questions, and the shame of her choices would no longer stay hidden. What began as a moment of reckless passion had spiraled into a nightmare, one that ended with her husband's body on a stretcher and her secrets balanced on the edge of exposure. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was the woman who had watched her husband die, knowing the truth, and said nothing. And soon, that silence would become her loudest confession. The honeymoon suite should have been a sanctuary, a place where the bride and groom could retreat from the chaos of the wedding and step into their new life together. Instead, it had become a chamber of dread. The groom lay sprawled across the bed, his breath shallow, his skin mottled and clammy. The sheets were stained with sweat and something darker, fluids seeping from the wounds that had spread overnight. The smell clung to everything, the curtains, the carpet, even the bride's hair. It was the unmistakable odor of death setting in far too soon. She stood by the window, staring at the city skyline, as if the answer might appear among the glittering lights. Her gown was wrinkled, her makeup smeared, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the man on the bed, and the truth that gnawed at her from the inside out. She could still hear his last clear words echoing in her skull. "You betrayed me." When she turned back toward him, she saw his body twitch, a convulsion rippling through him. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy but burning with a final burst of anger. "What did you do?" he rasped, voice so weak she had to lean closer to catch it. "What did you give me?" The bride's heart slammed against her ribs. She wanted to confess, to spill everything, to beg for forgiveness. But fear choked her words. If she admitted the truth, it wouldn't just destroy her marriage, it would destroy her life. So she lied again, her voice breaking. "Nothing, baby. I don't know what's happening. Please, just hold on." But the groom wasn't convinced. Even in his fragile state, he tried to push himself up on his elbows, glaring at her with the fury of a man who had built his world on trust, only to watch it collapse. His strength faltered, and he fell back against the pillows, coughing violently. Each cough tore at his chest, leaving streaks of blood on the sheets. The sight was unbearable, and yet she couldn't look away. The argument escalated into something surreal, a tragic theater where love, betrayal, and death collided. He accused her of hiding something, demanded to know the truth. She cried, screamed that she loved him, begged him to stop asking questions. But her tears only made him more certain. "You left," he gasped, his voice a mix of rage and despair. "I saw you weren't here. Who were you with?" She froze. In that moment, silence was louder than any denial. His face contorted with realization, and the look he gave her pierced deeper than any knife. It wasn't just anger, it was heartbreak, the kind that stripped a man of all will to fight. He turned his face away, and for the first time, she saw resignation in his eyes. As night fell, his condition spiraled downward. Fever consumed him, and the wounds spread grotesquely fast, splitting skin, oozing infection. His breathing grew ragged, each inhale rattling like broken glass. She hovered helplessly, torn between calling for help and preserving her secret. Every second she waited tightened the noose around her conscience. Finally, when his body arched in agony and a scream tore from his throat, she cracked. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. But as she raised it to her ear, he snatched her wrist with surprising strength. His grip was iron, his eyes wild with pain and fury. "Don't you dare," he snarled through clenched teeth. "Don't call them. I don't want the world to know." His pride, his reputation, his horror at being seen in this state. He wanted to die in silence rather than expose what was happening. The bride broke down, sobbing hysterically. She dropped the phone, clutching his hand, swearing she never meant to hurt him. But the damage was already done. Minutes later, his body gave its final fight. His chest heaved violently, his limbs spasmed, and then stillness. His eyes rolled back, his jaw slackened, and a terrible silence swallowed the room. She pressed her hands against his chest, tried pushing down in frantic compressions, screaming his name, begging him to breathe. But each pump only forced more fluid from his lungs, splattering onto the sheets. By the time paramedics stormed the suite, the scene was beyond saving. They pulled her back, their faces grim as they examined the body. One whispered to another, "This is advanced necrosis. This doesn't happen in hours. Something's off here." They tried resuscitation, but after minutes of failure, one shook his head and called a time of death. The bride collapsed onto the floor, her sobs echoing through the suite. Her wedding gown, once a symbol of purity and joy, was now soaked with sweat and tears, pressed against the carpet that reeked of decay. Outside, the hotel staff whispered nervously in the hallway, their perfect five-star reputation shattered by the horror unfolding inside room 807. When detectives arrived, they wasted no time. They photographed the body, bagged the sheets, and collected the champagne glasses on the nightstand. The untouched flute and the one with lipstick smudges told a story she didn't want told. One detective leaned close to her, his voice steady but firm. "Something happened here, and we're going to find out what. Tell us now, what did you do?" She shook her head violently, insisting she knew nothing. But her trembling, her evasive eyes, the way she kept glancing at her phone, all of it screamed otherwise. And in that moment, she realized there was no way out. Her husband was dead, and the truth she had tried so desperately to bury was already clawing its way to the surface. The honeymoon had ended not with love, not with promises of forever, but with a body bag carried through a hotel lobby under the flash of cameras. The world would know. The family would demand answers. The detectives would dig until they found the X, until they unearthed the betrayal. And the bride, once celebrated as a vision of beauty and devotion, now stood as the prime suspect in a crime born from lust and silence. What she thought she could control had consumed her, and in the end, it wasn't just her husband's body that rotted in that room. It was the future, the marriage, and the very identity she had tried to preserve. And when the door of the suite finally slammed shut behind the coroner, the bride was left with nothing but the crushing weight of her choices and the certainty that the nightmare had only just begun. The investigation began before the groom's body was even wheeled out of the honeymoon suite. Detectives recognized immediately that this wasn't a simple medical emergency. The grotesque state of the groom's wounds, so advanced they resembled days-old rot, was inconsistent with the timeline of his death. Something had accelerated the process. Something unnatural. They treated the suite as a crime scene. Photographers snapped every detail. The champagne flutes on the nightstand, the stained sheets, the bride's crumpled veil on the floor. Evidence technicians swabbed the bathroom sink, bagged tissue with traces of blood, and carefully lifted the groom's cell phone from the nightstand. Everything could matter because nothing about this death made sense. The bride sat slumped in a chair, still in her wedding dress, her eyes glassy from tears. She told the detectives the same story she had rehearsed in her head. Her husband fell sick suddenly in the night. She thought it was food poisoning, and when his condition worsened, she panicked and called 911. She insisted she had no idea what caused it, but her voice cracked too often. Her hands shook not only from shock but from guilt. Detectives noticed. At the medical examiner's office, the autopsy revealed the horrifying truth. The groom had died from fulminant sepsis, an infection so aggressive it tore through his body in less than 12 hours. Cultures taken for his wounds identified a rare, drug-resistant bacterial strain usually found in untreated sexually transmitted infections. To the pathologist, the evidence was unmistakable. He hadn't been poisoned with chemicals or drugs. He had been infected. That revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. If the infection had been introduced that night, it meant someone had passed it to him. And given that he had spent the night with only one person, the bride, the circle of suspicion tightened immediately. Detectives subpoenaed the hotel's security footage. What they found cracked the bride's story wide open. At 12:17 a.m., a camera in the hallway captured her leaving the honeymoon suite, wrapped in a shawl, her face partially turned away. At 1:42 a.m., the same camera recorded her return. For over an hour and a half, she had been gone, while her new husband lay alone. Pressed with this evidence, the bride broke down in her second interview. She admitted leaving the room, but claimed she only needed space, that the pressure of the wedding overwhelmed her. But detectives weren't satisfied. They dug deeper, tracking keycard logs that showed another guest room had been accessed repeatedly that same night. That room was booked under a false name. Yet cross-referenced with payment information, it traced back to one man, her ex-boyfriend. Witnesses from the reception confirmed seeing him. A bridesmaid admitted she'd spotted the bride slipping away with someone who wasn't her husband. A groomsman recalled overhearing an argument between the bride and her groom earlier in the evening about her disappearing act. Piece by piece, the puzzle aligned, and it pointed directly to the betrayal. Detectives tracked down the ex within days. When they brought him in for questioning, his appearance told its own story. He was gaunt, his skin sallow, and lesions dotted his arms. Medical records confirmed what detectives suspected. He had been battling a chronic, drug-resistant infection for months, refusing proper treatment. He admitted seeing the bride on the wedding night, though he insisted it was consensual, that she had come to him willingly. To prosecutors, it didn't matter whether it was willing or reckless. What mattered was that she knew who he was. She knew his history, and by choosing to be with him, then returning to her husband, she had passed along something lethal. Whether she intended to kill her husband or not, her betrayal and her choices had made her responsible. As the story hit the press, the media frenzy exploded. Headlines blared: bride accused of sleeping with ex on wedding night, groom dead hours later. Talk shows speculated endlessly about motive. Was it cold-blooded murder, a crime of passion, or simply the most catastrophic mistake imaginable? Social media split into camps, some condemning her as a murderer, others painting her as a tragic figure caught in her own web of shame. Meanwhile, forensic evidence mounted. Swabs from the groom's body matched the same bacterial strain found in the ex-hotel linens from the ex's room, carried traces of the bride's DNA. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed the damning invitation. One last time. Tonight. She had reached out to her ex before she ever walked down the aisle. Detectives confronted her with the evidence. At first, she denied everything, but under the weight of the facts, her facade crumbled. She confessed to the affair, sobbing that it was never meant to go this far. She claimed she thought the ex was clean, that she didn't know he still carried the infection. But investigators were skeptical. Her phone showed weeks of prior conversations, discussions about his health, messages where he admitted, "I'm not cured. I still got it." That single line obliterated her defense. That single line obliterated her defense. It proved her secret was no accident. Her choices had led directly to her husband's death. And yet, she chose to risk everything, to gamble not only with her own life, but with her husband's. By the time prosecutors laid out the case, the narrative was devastating. The bride had stepped out of her wedding suite to indulge in a secret encounter. In doing so, she delivered her husband a death sentence, then watched him wither without calling for help until it was too late. They charged her with involuntary manslaughter, criminal negligence, and reckless endangerment. The ex was charged as well for knowingly exposing another man to a deadly infection. Inside the courthouse, reporters crowded the hallways, snapping photos of the bride led and wearing handcuffs, her once celebrated beauty dulled by exhaustion and shame. The groom's family filled the benches, their faces etched with rage and grief. To them, it wasn't just betrayal, it was murder in the cruelest form. And as the trial loomed, one chilling truth hung over every witness, every testimony, every headline. The groom hadn't been killed by a gun, a knife, or poison. He had been killed by silence, by the secret his bride carried into their marriage and the choice she made to protect herself instead of him. The investigation had turned a tragic wedding into a national scandal. But for the detectives who pieced it together, the case wasn't about gossip. It was about accountability. They had followed the trail of bacteria, betrayal, and lies to its brutal conclusion. And now, the court would decide what price the bride would pay for a night of passion that ended in death. The courthouse was packed on the morning of the trial. Reporters filled the steps outside, microphones raised high as camera shutters clicked with every arrival. Inside, the bride was led into the courtroom in a plain beige suit, her hair pulled back, her face pale. The woman who had once been celebrated as the glowing centerpiece of a lavish wedding was now a defendant, her wrists trembling as she clutched a stack of tissues. Across the aisle, the groom's family sat rigid in the front row, their grief hardened into something colder, rage. His mother refused to look at her, staring instead at the empty seat where her son should have been, her hand wrapped tightly around a folded funeral program she brought with her every day of the proceedings. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. In his opening statement, the district attorney painted a picture of betrayal so shocking that the jurors leaned forward in their seats. This case is not about bad judgment. It is about recklessness so extreme it became lethal. On the night she promised to love and protect her husband, the defendant left her wedding suite, sought out her ex-lover, and returned carrying a death sentence she passed on to her new husband. And then, she chose silence over truth, watching him die rather than face her own shame. His voice rang through the room, each word landing like a gavel. The defense countered with a different narrative. Her lawyer, a seasoned trial attorney with a calm, measured tone, insisted this was never about murder. She made a mistake, an awful, tragic mistake, but it was not a crime. She did not intend to kill her husband. She did not know the extent of her ex's illness. And when her husband fell ill, she panicked, as anyone might. She is guilty of poor choices, yes. But of manslaughter? Of criminal negligence that justifies decades behind bars? No. Over the next 2 weeks, the courtroom became a stage for the most intimate, humiliating details of the bride's life. Forensic experts took the stand first, testifying about the bacteria that ravaged the groom's body. They explained the rare, drug-resistant strain, how it spread rapidly through his system, and how the genetic markers match cultures taken from the ex-lover. The jury winced as photos of the groom's decayed flesh were displayed on a screen, the images grotesque and undeniable. Next came the digital trail. Investigators presented the text messages exchanged between the bride and her ex-jurors read her invitation. One last time. Tonight. And his ominous reply. You know I'm not cured. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and the bride broke down in tears, burying her face in her hands. It was the moment the case seemed sealed, proof she knew the risk and ignored it. The most emotional testimony came from the groom's sister. She described the joy of the wedding day, the laughter, the dances, the way her brother looked at his bride, as if she were the center of the universe. Her voice cracked when she spoke of the phone call hours later, when she learned he was gone. He loved her. He trusted her with everything, and she took that trust and killed him with it. The jury watched her wipe her eyes, and even some of them blinked back tears. When it was the defense's turn, they put the bride herself on stand. Her voice shook as she admitted to the affair. She said she felt trapped between passion and duty, that she had been drinking, that her judgment was clouded. She insisted she never meant to harm her husband, that she thought her ex was exaggerating his condition, and that when her husband fell sick, fear paralyzed her. I didn't know what to do, she cried. I thought it would pass. I didn't want to ruin everything. Her words filled the courtroom with a mix of pity and contempt. Some jurors softened, others hardened, unmoved. Closing arguments were the final battle. The prosecutor's voice thundered. This is not about love triangles or heartbreak. It is about responsibility. She knew. She chose herself over him. And now he is dead. He pointed to the groom's mother in the gallery. Ask her if intention matters when she had to bury her son 3 days after his wedding. The defense pleaded for mercy, urging the jury to see the tragedy as human failure, not criminal malice. Do not let grief blind you to the truth, he said softly. She is guilty of betrayal, yes, but not of murder. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 days. The bride sat at the defense table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white, staring at the floor as the foreperson finally rose to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. The words fell like stones. Gasps rippled through the room. The groom's family embraced, sobbing. The bride collapsed against her attorney, her body shaking. At sentencing, the judge's voice was stern but not without a trace of sorrow. You carried into your marriage a secret that destroyed it before it had even begun. While the court recognizes you did not set out to kill, your choices directly caused a man's death. And for that, you must be held accountable. He handed down a sentence of 22 years in state prison. The bride sobbed openly as deputies pulled her hands behind her back, the clink of handcuffs echoing through the courtroom. Outside, reporters shouted questions as the groom's mother clutched her daughter and said into the cameras, "We didn't just lose a son. We lost the life he was supposed to have. He deserved better than betrayal." The bride was led away, her head bowed, no veil to hide her face this time. The fairy tale had ended not with a happily ever after, but with a prison sentence and a coffin lowered into the ground. And as the courtroom emptied, the echo of that verdict lingered, a haunting reminder that one night of weakness, one secret kept, can unravel everything: love, trust, even life itself. In the weeks after the sentencing, the case refused to fade from the public eye. News outlets ran nightly segments dissecting every detail: the secret texts, the hotel surveillance footage, the shocking speed of the infection that killed the groom. Talk shows debated whether the bride was a cold-blooded killer or simply a tragic figure caught in a web of her own making. On podcasts, legal analysts argued about intent versus negligence, replaying courtroom audio for millions of listeners. The story became less about two people and more about what it symbolized: betrayal, shame, and the irreversible consequences of silence. On social media, the narrative split into camps. Some users posted hashtags like hashtag Justice for the Groom and flooded timelines with photos of him smiling on his wedding day, holding champagne, dancing with his sister. He deserved a lifetime, not a night, one viral post read. Others, though fewer, expressed pity for the bride, insisting she had been foolish, not malicious. But pity rarely goes viral. Memes spread instead side-by-side photos of her in her wedding gown and her prison jumpsuit, captioned with biting sarcasm, from honeymoon suite to cell block suite. For the groom's family, the trial brought no real closure. His mother spoke at a vigil held outside the church where he had been married, candles flickering against the night sky. "We celebrated his beginning here," she said, voice quivering, "and now we stand here grieving his end. Betrayal is a wound that doesn't heal." The crowd murmured prayers, some clutching photos, others shaking their heads in disbelief at how quickly joy had turned to tragedy. In prison, the bride began a new existence far removed from the glittering ballroom where she once twirled in lace and pearls. Letters trickled in, some filled with hate, others with strange sympathy. She wrote one reply that later leaked through court documents. "I wake every morning knowing I chose my secret over truth. And now betrayal is all I have left." Her words only fueled the public fascination, reinforcing the image of a woman destroyed by her own choices. The ex-lover faced his own trial, though his case attracted less media attention. Convicted for knowingly exposing others to his infection, he received a shorter sentence, but his name became forever linked to the scandal. In many ways, he had been the match that lit the fire, but it was the bride's decision to step into his room on her wedding night that turned a spark into an inferno. Over time, the case became a cautionary tale told not just on crime shows, but in everyday conversations about loyalty, temptation, and the weight of hidden truths. Pastors referenced it in sermons about the sanctity of vows. Counselors pointed to it when warning couples about secrets. Parents whispered it to their children as a reminder that choices made in a moment can cost a lifetime. In the end, the story lived on not because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed. That love without honesty is fragile, that passion without restraint is dangerous, and that silence can be as deadly as any weapon. The bride entered her marriage carrying a secret she thought she could bury. Instead, it buried her husband and shattered two families. The final image the public remembers is not of the wedding kiss or the first dance. It is of a bride, handcuffed and weeping, let out of a courtroom while cameras flashed. Her white gown replaced by beige fabric, her tiara by prison shackles. A stark reminder that in one night of betrayal, she traded forever for nothing. And as the story faded from the headlines, one truth lingered. A marriage built on lies can rot faster than any wound, and the cost of silence can be a life.